Welcome back to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we break down complex legal topics for all you law students out there.
Absolutely.
And today we're going deep into a subject that's super relevant, but also kind of a head-scratcher, environmental harm in India.
Oh, yeah, it's a big one.
Specifically, we're going to untangle the legal remedies that are available when it comes to this.
Okay.
We're talking about things like public nuisance, the concept of absolute liability, and what criminal law has to say about all this.
Sounds good.
We'll also be looking at how recent developments, like the BNS of 2023
Okay.
and the BNSS of 2023, kind of fit into this whole puzzle.
Got it.
And of course, we can't forget about all those other important statutory remedies that are out there, the ones that are crucial for making sure our environment is protected.
It's interesting, because India has actually done a pretty good job of weaving environmental protection right into its legal framework.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We're not just talking about a few specific laws here.
Right.
It's like embedded in their constitution, even in their common law principles.
Yeah. Huh. So it's a pretty comprehensive approach then.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so let's unpack all of this. It sounds like we've got like a whole toolbox full of legal tools we can use when we're talking about fighting environmental harm. Where do we even start with all this?
Well, it might surprise you to know that environmental harm often falls under tort law, believe it or not.
Tort law? You're kidding, right? I always thought that was more about like personal injury stuff, slip and falls and things like that.
Right.
How does that apply to something as big as environmental harm?
Well, you got to think of torts as those civil wrongs, actions that end up causing harm to somebody else.
Okay.
And nuisances is, that key concept we always talk about in tort law. That's a really useful tool we can use when we're dealing with environmental harm.
So we're not just talking about, your neighbor blasting music at 2:04 a.m., keeping you awake. No, not quite.
Right.
We're talking about stuff that interferes with the public's right to a healthy environment, like industrial pollution that affects a whole neighborhood.
Yeah. Or a factory pumping out all those nasty fumes that make people sick. That's what we're talking about when we say public nuisance.
Okay, I see how this all connects now, but are there any, real cases out there that show us how this public nuisance idea has actually been used in environmental situations?
Oh, there are a bunch.
Like what?
Like this case, Ramlal versus Mustafabad Oil and Cotton Ginning.
Okay.
Basically, the court came out and said that if the noise from any activity, even if it's totally legal, if it's louder than what's allowed, it can be considered public nuisances.
Interesting.
And you know what that means? Those folks responsible for the noise, they could be held liable.
Yeah.
They might have to pay damages.
So it's not just about whether something's allowed or not. It's about the actual impact it has on the environment and whether people are getting hurt.
Exactly.
Makes sense. But what happens when it's not the entire community that's affected? Yeah. What if it's just one person or their property that gets harmed?
Well, that's where private nuisance comes in.
Private nuisance.
Imagine this pollution from a factory right next door is messing up your crops or, contaminating your well water.
Ugh, that's awful.
Yeah, that's private nuisance, and you might be able to take legal action to get some kind of remedy for that specific harm.
So we've got public nuisance and private nuisance. I get it. What other legal options are there within tort law when it comes to addressing environmental harm?
Well, trespass is another big one.
Trespass.
Yeah, like someone dumping toxic waste on your land without asking, that's a clear case of trespass.
Right.
But it can be more sneaky, too.
Sneaky how?
There's a case, Fairview Farms Incorporated versus Reynolds Metals Company.
Okay.
The court decided that pollutants from a factory that were floating in the air and ended up on someone else's land, that could be considered trespass too.
Wow. So
Yeah.
even if you can't see it, if it's something harmful and it gets onto your property without your permission, that's trespass?
It's like the law is recognizing that environmental harm can show up in all sorts of ways and that your property rights aren't just about someone physically stepping onto your land.
Right.
But on top of trespass, we also have to think about negligence.
Negligence. Like when someone's just not careful enough, it ends up causing harm.
Yep.
How does that work when we're talking about the environment?
Think about a company that doesn't bother to keep their equipment in good shape, and then boom, there's a chemical spill that pollutes a river nearby.
Oh, yeah.
Or a construction project that just ignores all the rules about preventing soil erosion, and you end up with all the sediment that damages the ecosystem in a lake or river.
If those are some bad scenarios.
Yeah, those are examples of negligence.
So it's like failing to do what you're supposed to do to prevent harm to the environment.
Right.
Are there any cases that show us what can happen legally when someone's negligent like that?
There's this really sad case, Naresh Dutt Tyagi versus State of Uttar Pradesh. Pesticide fumes leaked from a government facility and people living nearby actually died.
Oh my gosh, that's terrible.
Yeah, the court found the government was negligent because they hadn't taken the right precautions to prevent that leak.
Wow.
It's a reminder that when you're dealing with environmental hazards, being careless can have really awful consequences.
Absolutely. So we've talked about nuisance trespass and negligence,
Mhm.
all these concepts that come from tort law.
Right.
What other legal tools do we have, especially when we want to hold industries accountable for the harm they do to the environment?
Well, now we're getting into strict liability and absolute liability. Those are really important ideas in environmental law.
Okay.
Strict liability basically means if you're doing something that's inherently dangerous
Mm.
and something bad happens,
Uh,
you're on the hook for the damage, even if you weren't negligent.
Wait a minute. Even if you did everything by the book, if something goes wrong, you're still responsible.
That's the idea behind strict liability.
Wow.
It comes from the understanding that some activities are just so risky that whoever's doing them has to be the one responsible for any harm, even if they didn't mean for it to happen.
Interesting.
Like the classic example is that Rylands versus Fletcher case.
Oh, yeah. The case with the escaping reservoir. I remember that one from torts class.
Uh-huh, yep, that's the one.
So how does that principle apply to environmental harm?
Okay, say a company is storing hazardous waste, even if they follow all the rules and they have all these safety measures in place.
Okay.
If there's a leak that contaminates the groundwater, they'd be held liable under strict liability.
It's like you're saying, if you're dealing with dangerous stuff, you got to be prepared to deal with the consequences no matter what.
Exactly. It's recognizing that some activities just come with a certain level of risk, and those who engage in them have to be accountable for any harm that results.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned absolute liability. What's that all about? Is that like strict liability on steroids or something?
Uh-huh. You could say that.
Oh.
Absolute liability takes things a step further. It gets rid of any exceptions or defenses when it comes to holding industries liable for the harm caused by these inherently dangerous activities.
Wow, no way out, huh?
Nope.
So what's a good example of that?
The landmark case, MC Mehta versus Union of India, also known as the oleum gas leak case.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Yeah, a gas leak from a fertilizer plant caused a lot of damage in Delhi.
Yeah, it was awful.
The Supreme Court in that case said that industries doing these super hazardous activities have an absolute duty to make sure no harm comes from their operations.
Wow.
They're responsible for any harm caused no matter what precautions they've taken. It was a huge judgment that sent a clear message: safety and environmental protection have to come first no matter what.
It sounds like India's legal system is pretty serious about making sure industries operate responsibly, especially when what they're doing poses a risk to the environment and public health.
Very.
But I'm curious, are there any actual criminal laws that deal specifically with environmental harm? I mean, we'd be talking about civil remedies like nuisance and strict liability.
Right.
But are there ever situations where someone who pollutes could actually face criminal charges?
Oh, absolutely. We can't forget about criminal law when it comes to protecting the environment.
Right.
India has provisions, right, in its criminal code that deal with environmental offenses.
Interesting.
And that's where the BNS and the BNSS enter the picture.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the BNS and the BNSS all about, and how do they relate to environmental harm?
So the BNS stands for Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. It basically replaced the Indian Penal Code back in 2023.
Okay.
And the BNSS, that's the Bharatiya Nagarika Suraksha Sanhita. It's the new Code of Criminal Procedure, also from 2023.
2023 was a big year for legal changes in India.
It was.
Got it.
Both of these new codes, they have specific sections dealing with environmental offenses.
So it's like India updated and made its laws more comprehensive to cover all sorts of criminal offenses, including those that hurt the environment.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So what kind of specific provisions are we talking about?
Well, for instance, Section 270 of the BNS defines public nuisance in a way that directly applies to environmental harm. It talks about actions or even inactions that endanger or annoy the public.
That's pretty broad. What sorts of things would fall under that definition?
It could be anything, really, from improperly getting rid of hazardous waste to running a factory that's spewing out nasty fumes,
Right.
polluting a water body, or even making so much noise that it disrupts the whole community.
So it's not just about those big industrial accidents.
Right.
It's also about the everyday things people do that can negatively impact the environment.
Exactly.
And what about the BNSS? What's its role in all of this?
The BNSS gives authorities like district magistrates the power to step in and remove public nuisances. It's
Hmm.
like a legal way to deal with environmental harm that affects a whole community.
Okay, so it sounds like India's legal system has this whole multi-pronged approach to environmental protection. They use both civil and criminal law to hold people and industries accountable for what they do.
That's right.
It's amazing how all these different pieces fit together.
It is.
But I got to admit, I'm still trying to wrap my head around all these legal concepts and how they actually play out in the real world.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, for sure.
It is. But that's why we're here, right? To break down these complicated ideas and make them easier to understand.
That's right.
We've covered a lot of ground already, starting with the basics of tort law, then diving into the intricacies of strict and absolute liability, and now we've even touched on the criminal law side of environmental protection.
We have.
But it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have.
What else do we need to consider when we're talking about legal remedies for environmental harm in India?
Well, we can't forget about the foundation of all of this, the Indian Constitution. It actually sets the stage for how environmental protection works in the country.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about specific laws. It's about how environmental protection is baked right into India's legal system.
Exactly. And then there's this whole area of statutory remedies, those specific laws that deal with particular environmental issues.
Right.
We got to dig into those too to really get a complete picture of how India tackles environmental harm.
It sounds like we've got a lot more to explore. This is definitely a deep dive,
It is.
and I'm excited to learn more about these other aspects of environmental law in India. But for now, let's take a break.
Sounds good.
When we come back, we'll dive into the constitutional foundations of environmental protection in India and how those have shaped the legal landscape. Stay tuned.
I'm ready.
All right.
Welcome back to LexTalks. Before the break, we were talking about all those different legal ways to tackle environmental harm in India. Things like torts and liability.
It was a lot to take in.
It was. But now let's switch gears a bit and look at the foundation of all those legal tools. The Indian Constitution.
All right, so now we're getting into constitutional law. I'm curious to see how environmental protection is actually part of India's legal system.
Well, the really interesting thing is that environmental protection isn't just like an afterthought. It's built right into the Indian Constitution. Articles 48A and 51AG, those are the key players here.
Okay.
Article 48A, which was added in by the 42nd Amendment, specifically tells the state, hey, you got to protect and improve the environment and safeguard the forests and wildlife.
So the government has a clear duty to care for the environment. But what about the responsibility of individuals? Does the Constitution say anything about our role in protecting the environment?
That's where Article 51AG comes in. It lists the fundamental duties of every Indian citizen.
Okay.
And one of those duties is the obligation to protect and improve the natural environment that includes forests, lakes, rivers, wildlife, the whole shebang.
So it's not just the government's job, it's a collective effort. I like that.
Yeah.
But how much weight do these constitutional provisions actually have? I mean, are they just nice ideas, or have they actually changed how environmental law is interpreted and applied in India?
Oh, they've had a huge impact.
Really?
The Indian courts have consistently upheld and interpreted these constitutional principles in some really important judgments that have shaped environmental law in the country.
Can you give me some examples?
Yeah.
Cases that show how powerful these constitutional provisions are when it comes to protecting the environment.
Absolutely. One of the most important ones is the Rural Litigation and Entitlement Kendra versus State of UP case from back in 1985.
Okay.
This case established the duty of both the state and citizens to protect the environment as stated in Article 51 AG. It was a landmark decision recognizing environmental protection as a fundamental duty.
That was back in 1985.
Yeah.
That's interesting to see that the courts were emphasizing the importance of environmental protection even back then.
Mm-hmm.
What other cases come to mind?
Well, there's L.K. Coolwell versus State of Rajasthan in 1988, which reinforced the idea that citizens can go to court to enforce environmental protection duties.
So it's not just about having laws. It's about making sure citizens have the power to use the legal system to actually fight for environmental protection.
Exactly. It empowered people to hold the government and private companies accountable for environmental harm.
That's a big deal.
Right.
What other cases stand out?
A truly groundbreaking case was M.C. Mehta versus State of Orissa in 1992. This one connected the right to a healthy environment to Article 21 of the Constitution, the right to life.
Wow. So basically the court said that a healthy environment is essential for a good life and therefore a fundamental right. That must have been a game changer for environmental law in India.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
It set a precedent that environmental protection isn't just a policy goal. It's a fundamental right that the courts must protect.
That's huge. And was that line of thinking continued in other cases?
Oh, yeah. It was reinforced in the Ames Students Union versus Ames case in 2001, which emphasized the state's duty to protect the environment under both fundamental duties and directive principles of state policy.
So it seems like India is really serious about making environmental protection a core part of its legal system, with the Constitution as the foundation, and the courts actively interpreting and upholding these principles.
You got it.
But what about specific laws created by the legislature? I know India has quite a few environmental statutes that address specific issues.
You're right. On top of that constitutional foundation, India also has a strong set of environmental laws that provide more specific ways to deal with environmental challenges.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. The Constitution sets the big picture and principles, while specific laws give the tools to actually deal with things like pollution, deforestation, and other environmental problems.
Exactly. It's a multi-layered system designed to be comprehensive in tackling environmental issues.
Okay, so let's break down some of these key environmental statutes. What are some of the most important ones that law students should know about?
Well, one of the most important ones is the Environment Protection Act of 1986.
Okay,
This act is kind of like a Swiss Army knife for environmental protection.
I like that.
It gives the central government a lot of power to do what's necessary to prevent and control pollution.
Mm,
It lets them set environmental standards, issue directions for environmental protection, and even shut down polluting industries if they have to.
that's some serious authority. It sounds like this act is a powerful tool for dealing with a wide range of environmental problems. But what about specific issues like air and water pollution? Are there laws that focus on those?
Of course. There's the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act of 1974, which aims to keep our water bodies clean by regulating what pollutants can be discharged into them.
Okay.
It set up pollution control boards at both the central and state levels to keep an eye on water quality and make sure the law is being followed.
So it's not just about setting standards. There's a system in place to make sure people are actually complying with the law.
That's good to know.
What about air pollution?
We've got the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act of 1981. This one's all about improving air quality by setting limits on emissions from industries and vehicles. It also gives the government the power to take action against those who break the rules.
So it sounds like India has really put a lot of thought into creating a legal framework to deal with environmental
They
challenges.
have.
But I'm curious, how effective are these laws in reality? Are polluters actually held accountable, or do they find ways to get around the law?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And the answer is it's a bit of a mixed bag. There have been some big cases where the courts have enforced these laws and made polluters pay up.
Good. Like what?
One great example is the Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum versus Union of India case from 1996. In this case, the Supreme Court upheld the polluter pays principle, which means that whoever pollutes the environment has to bear the cost of cleaning up the mess they made.
That makes sense. It seems only fair that those who create environmental problems should be the ones fixing them. Are there any other cases that show how these laws have been used successfully to protect the environment?
Definitely. There have been many successful prosecutions under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, leading to convictions for poaching and the illegal wildlife trade. And the Indian Forest Act of 1927 has been used to stop deforestation and protect those valuable forest resources.
Well, it's not all bad news. There are times when these laws have been enforced effectively, and that's led to some positive outcomes for the environment.
There are.
But I imagine enforcement is a constant battle, especially in a country as large and diverse as India.
It is. Enforcement is a major challenge, and there's a lot of debate about how to make penalties tougher, streamline those enforcement mechanisms, and make sure these laws are really working across the country. It's a constant fight against those who put profit ahead of protecting the environment.
That's a good point. It makes me wonder what role ordinary citizens play in all of this. Can they do anything to help make sure these environmental laws are enforced? Or are they just at the mercy of government agencies and big companies?
Citizens have a huge role to play, and they have a powerful tool at their disposal. Public interest litigation, or PIL for short.
PIL, I've heard of that, but I'm not totally clear on what it is. Can you explain how it works and how it's been used to deal with environmental issues in India?
Sure, PIL is basically a way for citizens to go directly to the courts to address issues that affect the public good, including environmental problems. It's been a game changer because it lets individuals and groups raise awareness about environmental problems, challenge government inaction, and demand that environmental laws are enforced.
So it's a legal tool that gives ordinary people the power to hold those in power accountable for protecting the environment.
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Are there any famous examples of PILs that have made a real difference in environmental protection?
Oh, there are tons. One that stands out is the TN Godavarman Thurumulpad versus Union of India case, which started in 1995 and has been going on for decades.
Decades, wow.
It started by focusing on protecting forests in a specific area, but then it expanded to cover broader forest conservation issues across all of India. The Supreme Court has issued a bunch of directives that have had a lasting impact on how forests are managed and protected in the country.
That's incredible. It shows real dedication from both the courts and the people who brought the case. I'm starting to see that environmental protection in India isn't just about laws and regulations. It's also about the people who care about protecting their environment and are willing to fight for it.
You're absolutely right. It's a collective effort that needs people to be watchful, speak up, and be willing to hold both themselves and those in power accountable for protecting our natural resources.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this area of law so dynamic and interesting.
I'm definitely feeling inspired by the stories of citizens and activists using the legal system to make real change. But it also makes me realize that there's so much more to learn. What else should we be thinking about when it comes to this topic?
Well, we've covered a lot, but there's still more to discuss. We need to talk about the challenges of actually putting these environmental laws into practice and making sure they're enforced. It's one thing to have laws written down, but making sure they actually protect the environment is another thing altogether.
That's a good point. No. What are some of the biggest obstacles to effective enforcement? And what's being done to try to overcome those challenges?
Those are excellent questions, and that's what we'll focus on in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore those complexities of enforcement, look at potential solutions, and discuss what the future might hold for environmental law in India.
We spent this deep dive really digging into the legal tools India has to fight environmental harm. But like we've mentioned, just having laws written down doesn't mean they're actually being used effectively. What are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to making sure those environmental laws are really working in India?
You hit the nail on the head. It's one thing to have these laws, but quite another to make sure they're actually protecting the environment. And India definitely faces some hurdles in that regard.
What are some of the most significant roadblocks?
Well, one major challenge is the sheer scale of the task.
Hmm.
India is a country that's developing rapidly with a booming economy and a huge population, trying to keep up with all that industrialization, urbanization, and economic growth, while also making sure everyone's following environmental rules. It's a massive undertaking.
It's like trying to catch a speeding train. It
Yeah.
feels like as the economy grows and new industries pop up, it gets harder and harder to keep track of everything and make sure everyone's following the rules.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big challenge, resources. Environmental agencies often just don't have enough people funding or even the technology they need to effectively monitor compliance and enforce regulations.
So it's a classic case of too much to do and not enough resources to do it. But even if you could magically give them all the resources they needed, wouldn't you still need people to actually follow the laws? How do you create a culture where everyone, individuals and corporations, actually cares about protecting the environment and makes it a priority?
That's such an important point. Effective enforcement isn't just about having laws and agencies to enforce them. It's about creating a sense of shared responsibility. And that takes a lot of public awareness and education.
So it's about more than just punishing those who break the law. It's about preventing environmental harm in the first place by teaching people about the environment and showing them how their actions have consequences.
Exactly. We need to be investing in educational campaigns that reach everyone, from kids in school to communities to industries.
Yeah.
People need to understand why environmental protection matters, how what they do impacts the environment, and what they can do to help.
Knowledge is power, right?
Mm-hmm.
The more people know about these issues, the more likely they are to support and follow environmental regulations. But it's not all on individuals, is it? We need to hold corporations accountable for how they treat the environment, too.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another really important part of enforcement, giving people the power to hold polluters accountable. We need strong laws to protect whistleblowers so people feel safe reporting environmental violations without being afraid of losing their jobs or facing other consequences.
Makes sense.
And we need to make sure that communities have access to information about the environmental risks they're facing. Transparency is key.
It's about creating a system where people feel like they can speak up and demand action when they see someone breaking environmental laws. And transparency is a big part of that. Yeah. The more information is out in the open, the more likely it is that violations will be exposed.
Right. And besides public awareness and citizen participation, we also have to look at making the laws themselves stronger. We need to make sure the penalties for environmental violations are tough enough to actually discourage polluters. And we might even need to introduce new laws or change existing ones to deal with new environmental challenges that come up.
So the legal system isn't set in stone. It has to evolve and adapt to new realities and challenges. What are some areas where the legal framework could be improved? What kind of changes might we see in the future?
One thing that legal experts and policymakers talk about a lot is the need for specialized environmental courts. Right now, environmental cases are usually heard in regular courts, which might not have the expertise or resources to deal with how complicated environmental law can be. Having dedicated environmental courts with judges who really understand environmental issues could make the legal process much more efficient and effective.
That makes sense. It's like having specialized doctors for different medical conditions. You're more likely to get the best outcome when you have experts handling complex cases. What other reforms are on the table?
Another possible reform is to make liability for environmental harm even stricter. India already has the concept of absolute liability for certain hazardous activities, but there's growing support for using that principle for more environmental offenses.
Hmm.
The thinking is that if companies know they'll be held responsible for any environmental damage they cause no matter what, they'll be more likely to make environmental protection a priority from the start.
It's about sending a message that polluting just isn't worth the risk, both financially and in terms of their reputation.
Exactly. And we're also seeing more interest in using restorative justice principles in environmental law. This means going beyond just punishing those who did wrong and focusing on actually fixing the damage done to the environment. It could mean requiring companies to not only pay fines, but also to take real steps to restore the ecosystems they harmed.
It's a more holistic approach, right? It's about healing the environment,
Right.
not just punishing the person who caused the harm.
It is. It's about recognizing that environmental harm affects all of us and that we have to work together to find solutions that are good for both people and the planet.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into environmental law in India. We've covered so much from the Constitution to specific laws to the roles citizens play in pushing for change. What would you say are the most important takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that protecting the environment in India is a team effort. It takes strong laws, effective enforcement, public awareness, people getting involved, and a commitment to constantly doing better. It's a work in progress, but the progress that's been made is really impressive.
And it's clear that the legal profession has a critical role to play in this ongoing fight to protect India's environment.
Absolutely. Lawyers, judges, policymakers, academics, everyone in the legal field has a responsibility to understand these issues, advocate for better environmental protections, and work towards a future that's more sustainable.
Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly informative and inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
It's been my pleasure. It's always great to have these conversations about such an important topic.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on LexTalks. We hope you found this exploration of environmental law in India insightful. Remember, protecting our environment is everyone's responsibility. Every action we take, no matter how small, can make a difference. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep learning. Thanks for being a part of LexTalks. Subscribe and keep learning with us.